What happens when a man thinks he's untouchable? Jonathan Blackwell, a kingpin in the ruthless world of DC politics, had it all. A vast fortune and a beautiful, powerful wife, Margaret Maggie Whitmore. But he wanted more. He wanted to humiliate her. At the most prestigious event of the year, he slapped his wife in front of his young mistress, a public execution of her dignity. But Jonathan made one fatal miscalculation. He forgot who her brother was. And as the most powerful lawyer in America walked in, Jonathan's entire world didn't just crumble, it detonated. The silence in the Blackwells' Georgetown mansion was a specific kind of quiet. It wasn't peaceful. It was the pressurized silence of a deep-sea trench, heavy and cold, waiting for an implosion. Margaret Maggie Whitmore Blackwell, heiress to a political dynasty that predated most of the city's monuments, was used to it. She stood in the center of the grand salon, her reflection staring back at her from the black, unlit fireplace. A tall, slender woman in a cashmere lounge set the color of oatmeal, her blonde hair pulled into a severe, elegant knot. She was 42, but looked a decade younger, though her eyes held a weariness that was centuries old. She was reviewing the seating chart for the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala. It was her baby, her one piece of leverage, the one thing in her life that was still truly hers. "Move Senator Harrison to table 3, she murmured to her assistant, a sharp young woman named Nadia. "He can't be at table 1, not this year." "Ma'am, he's a platinum donor, and he's your husband's man." Margaret's lips thinned. "He's my husband's liability. Put him with the energy lobbyists. They can bore each other to death. And place an empty seat at my table. My brother might be attending." Nadia's eyes widened slightly. "The Attorney General? Oh, ma'am, that's wonderful. His office confirmed he would be out of town." "Edward has a habit of changing his mind," Margaret said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for a fraction of a second. The thought of her brother, Edward Whitmore, was the only armor she had left. The front door slammed shut, the sound echoing off the cold marble of the foyer. Jonathan Blackwell had arrived. Margaret didn't flinch, but she felt the temperature in the room drop another 5 degrees. Jonathan stormed into the salon, ripping off his $3,000 Brioni tie and tossing it onto a priceless Louis XV chair. He was a handsome man, in a brutal, corporate way. Sharp jaw, slicked back dark hair, and eyes so dark they seemed to drink the light. He had come from nothing and had married into everything, and he wore his resentment like a second suit. "What is this I hear about you moving, Harrison?" he barked, not even looking at her. He was already pouring a heavy glass of scotch. Nadia immediately gathered her tablet. I'll just be in the study, Mrs. Blackwell." Margaret waited until the assistant had vanished. "Hello, Jonathan. Bad day on K Street?" "Don't play coy, Margaret. It doesn't suit you. You know Harrison is key to the new infrastructure deal. He needs to feel valued. He needs to be at your table, next to you. The Whitmore name is the only thing keeping him loyal." "The Whitmore name," Margaret said, her voice dangerously quiet, "is not a tool for you to close your filthy lobbying deals. This is a charity gala. We are funding hospitals, not highways." Jonathan laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Oh, the philanthropist, the saint of Georgetown. Do you have any idea what pays for this?" He gestured around the opulent room. "My filthy deals pay for your charity. They pay for this house. They pay for that oatmeal-colored, whatever that is you're wearing." He took a long swallow of scotch. "Harrison sits at table 1, or I swear to God, Margaret, I will pull the keynote speaker." "You wouldn't dare. The Secretary of State is my friend." "Everyone is my friend when I'm writing the checks," he sneered. "And speaking of your table, I'm bringing a guest, an associate from the firm. She'll be sitting with me." Margaret felt the familiar, cold dread knot in her stomach. She knew exactly what associate meant. For the last 6 months, it had meant Ruby Lane, a 25-year-old paralegal with aggressively white teeth and an ambition so naked it was practically pornographic. Margaret had seen them at Cafe Milano, had smelled Ruby's cloying perfume on his suits. "You will not," Margaret said. It was not a request. "You will not bring that girl to my foundation's gala. You will not embarrass me in front of my family, my friends, and the entire cabinet." Jonathan walked over to her, standing so close she could smell the scotch on his breath. He was a full head taller, and he used every inch of it. "Embarrass you?" he whispered, his voice a venomous hiss. "You're the embarrassment, Margaret. You're a cold, sterile, walking mausoleum. You're a name, not a woman. Ruby is a woman. She's alive. She's warm. She's grateful." He smiled, a truly cruel expression. "She's coming. And you will be polite. You will smile. You will act like the perfect political wife, or I will dismantle this life you love so much, piece by piece. Starting with your little pet project." He pointed to the seating chart. "And Harrison, table 1, or the Whitmore Foundation's primary donation for the quarter gets lost in an accounting error. Am I clear?" Margaret stared at the fireplace, at her own distorted reflection. She could fight him on this. She could call her lawyers. She could, finally, call Edward. But that would be all-out war. It would be the end of the Whitmore legacy, a scandal that would taint everything her parents had built. She was trapped, and he knew it. "Crystal," she whispered. "Good girl." He downed the rest of his scotch and walked out, dialing his phone as he went. "Ruby, baby?" "Yeah. Wear the red dress. The one I like." Margaret stood motionless for a full 5 minutes. The only sound was the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hall. The clock, like her, was just winding down, counting the seconds until the end. She picked up her tablet and moved Senator Harrison back to table 1. Then she deleted the empty place card for her brother. He wasn't coming. She was, as she had always been, completely on her own. Ruby Lane zipped up the red dress. It was a slinky, audacious column of crimson silk by Gucci, a dress that didn't just suggest. It demanded. It had cost Jonathan $8,000, and Ruby knew it was worth every penny. She spun in front of the mirror in her glittering, sterile apartment in the Wharf, a condo Jonathan paid for. The view of the Potomac was stunning, but Ruby rarely looked at it. She was too busy looking at her own reflection. She was everything Margaret Blackwell was not. Young, brunette, spectacularly curved, and, as Jonathan had said, grateful. She had grown up in a trailer park in West Virginia. Now she was on the arm of Jonathan Blackwell, one of the most powerful men in D.C. Tonight she wasn't just attending the Whitmore Foundation Gala. She was arriving. Her phone buzzed. It was Jonathan. Her stomach fluttered. "No mistakes" was Jonathan's code for don't talk too much, don't drink too much, and don't, under any circumstances, act impressed. She had been practicing. She'd studied Margaret Blackwell for months, watching her on C-SPAN, reading her in Vogue and Town and Country. Margaret was all ice and old money vowels. Ruby had been practicing that cool, dismissive stare in the mirror. She thought it made her look powerful. In reality, it made her look constipated. Jonathan was obsessed with Margaret, and Ruby hated him for it. Even when he was with Ruby, in the throes of passion, he would sometimes whisper things. "You're so much better than her," he'd groan. "So warm." But to Ruby, it sounded like he was just trying to convince himself. He didn't want Ruby. He wanted to hurt Margaret. Tonight, Ruby was the weapon he had chosen, and she was more than happy to be aimed. Jonathan arrived, not in his usual Bentley, but in a blacked-out Escalade. He looked incredible. His tuxedo was bespoke, fitting his broad shoulders perfectly. He smelled of money and power. "My God," he said, his eyes raking over her. "You look spectacular." "It's the dress you picked," she said, running a hand down his lapel. "No," he said, his voice hardening slightly as he grabbed her wrist. "It's the woman I picked." He kissed her, a hard, possessive kiss that was more about ownership than affection. Now let's go over the rules again. I know, Jonathan, she said, trying to sound bored. Smile, don't talk about policy, and stick by your side. And when you meet Margaret? Ruby's smile sharpened. I'll be polite. No, you'll be deferential, he corrected. You are my associate. She is my wife. The optics must be perfect. You show her respect. You call her Mrs. Blackwell. The entire drama will be in the fact that you are there at all. The whispers will do all the work for us. The less you do, the more it will kill her. Understand? Ruby deflated. She had imagined a confrontation, a glorious catfight where she would finally put the Ice Queen in her place. But I thought you wanted to— I want to control the narrative, he snapped. I want DC to see that I am in charge, that my wife is so modern. She understands I have needs, and that you are so loyal you'll sit at her table and sip her champagne. It's the ultimate power play. It shows I'm untouchable. He was right. It was far more cruel than a simple screaming match. It was a public cuckolding, gift-wrapped incivility. Ruby shivered, a thrill running through her. This was power. Real power. The drive to the National Portrait Gallery was quiet. The gala was being held in the Robert and Arlene Kogod courtyard, a magnificent, undulating, glass-canopied space that felt both ancient and futuristic. When they stepped out of the Escalade, the flashbulbs were blinding. Jonathan put a proprietary hand on the small of Ruby's back, guiding her past the press line. Jonathan! Jonathan Blackwell! A reporter from the Post shouted. Who's your guest? Jonathan smiled his $1,000,000 smile. This is Ruby Lane, my firm's most brilliant new associate. She's been indispensable on the infrastructure project. Inside, the courtyard was a sea of black tie and old money. Chandeliers dripped from the steel supports, and the sound of a string quartet battled with the hum of 1,000 conversations. Margaret, of course, was at the entrance, standing beside a massive Whitmore Foundation banner. She was wearing a midnight blue gown by Oscar de la Renta. It was severe, almost monastic, with long sleeves and a high neck. And on her, it was devastating. She looked like a queen. Ruby suddenly felt very cheap. Her red dress was too bright, too tight. Her heels were too high. She was a parody of a mistress. Jonathan, however, was beaming. He strode toward his wife, pulling Ruby along with him. Margaret, darling, he boomed, loud enough for the surrounding senators and ambassadors to hear. Margaret turned. Her eyes, a pale, icy blue, flickered over Jonathan, then landed on Ruby. She held that gaze for a solid 5 seconds. In that look, Ruby saw no anger, no jealousy, no pain. She saw only a vast, bottomless contempt and something else, pity. It was the most terrifying look she had ever received. Margaret glided forward, extending a perfectly manicured hand. Her voice was pure, cut-glass perfection. Miss Lane, she said, her smile not touching her eyes. Jonathan has told me so little about you. Welcome to the Foundation. I do hope you enjoy the salmon. She turned away before Ruby could even speak, greeting the ambassador from France with a warm, Jean-Pierre, how wonderful to see you. And Cecile, that Dior is divine. Jonathan's hand tightened on Ruby's back, his fingernails digging in. He was furious. Margaret had just dismissed her, dismissed them, as if they were the catering staff. He had wanted a scene, a gasp, a crack in the facade. She had given him nothing. Come on, he hissed, pulling Ruby toward their table. The night is young. She can't keep that mask on forever. But as Ruby sat down at table 1, directly across from Margaret's empty place setting, she had the sinking feeling that Jonathan Blackwell had just made a very, very big mistake. Table 1 was a microcosm of American power. There was Senator Harrison, looking florid and nervous. There was the CEO of a major defense contractor, a grizzled old power broker named Arlen Scott. There was the French ambassador and his wife. And there was Margaret, Jonathan, and Ruby. The tension was so thick, the waiters seemed hesitant to approach. Margaret was the perfect hostess. She discussed French Impressionism with the ambassador's wife, debated the merits of a new carbon capture technology with Arlen Scott, and listened with polite interest as Senator Harrison droned on about his subcommittee. She never once looked at Ruby. She barely even looked at Jonathan. She was a fortress, and her walls were 1,000 feet high. Jonathan, in turn, grew more and more agitated. He was being ignored at his own table. He had brought the grenade, and the hostess was treating it like a party favor. He drank. Champagne first, then he signaled a waiter for his scotch. He began to intentionally and loudly flirt with Ruby. "Miss Lane here," Jonathan announced to the table, "is the sharpest legal mind I've ever encountered. She single-handedly saved the transport deal. She found loopholes our senior partners have missed for years." Senator Harrison, who was part of that transport deal, choked on his sea bass. She did. I wasn't aware." "Oh yes," Jonathan said, placing his hand over Ruby's. "She's invaluable. I don't know what I'd do without her." Ruby blushed, a bright, ugly red that clashed with her dress. This was what she wanted, but now it felt clumsy and pathetic. Margaret continued her conversation with the French ambassador. "The new wing at the Children's Hospital will be named for my mother, yes. We're hoping to break ground in the spring." "She's ignoring us!" Jonathan hissed under his breath to Ruby, his smile now a rigid grimace. "Jonathan, maybe just let it go," Ruby whispered. She was starting to feel sick. The staring, the whispers, it was all aimed at her. The other women at the gala, wives of congressmen and titans of industry, were looking at her with a uniform expression of pitying disgust. They weren't judging Margaret. They were judging her. She was the cliché. "Let it go?" Jonathan refilled his own scotch from a decanter he'd demanded for the table. "I'm just getting started." The main presentation began. Margaret took the stage to give the opening remarks. The moment she stepped into the spotlight, the entire courtyard fell silent. She spoke with passion and precision about the Foundation's work, about infant mortality rates, about scholarship programs. She was radiant. The room was hers. She was, in that moment, completely and totally untouchable. She was a Whitmore, and this was her city. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. She returned to the table, her face flushed with a victory that had nothing to do with Jonathan. "Wonderful speech, darling," Jonathan said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Thank you, Jonathan," she replied, taking a sip of water. He couldn't take it anymore. The civility, the composure, the control she had. He needed to break it. He needed to prove to himself, to the table, to Ruby, that he was the one in charge. "You know," Jonathan said, his voice suddenly loud, carrying across the neighboring tables. "It's funny. Margaret is so good at caring for all those people, the poor, the sick." He sneered. "But at home, she's as cold as the marble in our foyer. It's a wonder she can even pretend to be human." The table went dead silent. Senator Harrison suddenly found the ceiling fascinating. The French ambassador's wife let out a tiny, horrified gasp. Ruby froze. "Jonathan, don't!" Margaret slowly placed her water glass down. She turned her head and looked, really looked, at her husband for the first time all night. Her expression was unreadable. "Are you drunk, Jonathan?" she asked, her voice low. "I'm honest," he shot back. "Maybe for the first time, I'm sitting here next to a warm, breathing woman," he gestured to Ruby. "And I'm across from a monument, a statue, something to be admired but never touched." "That is quite enough," Margaret said. The steel in her voice was absolute. "You are embarrassing yourself. You are embarrassing the Foundation, and you are embarrassing her." She gave Ruby a fleeting, almost kind glance. "This child you've dragged into your pathetic little psychodrama." "Child?" Ruby squeaked, stung. "Pathetic? Jonathan repeated, his face turning a dark, dangerous red. The alcohol and the narcissistic rage were mixing into a toxic cocktail. You think I'm pathetic? I know you are, Margaret said, rising slowly from her chair. You are a parasite, Jonathan. You leached onto my family, onto my name, and you've been sucking it dry for 15 years. You're a hollow man, and now you're a drunken hollow man. I'm done. She turned to leave the table. Enjoy the dessert, ladies and gentlemen. I must check on the kitchen. It was a perfect exit. Cool, dignified, and utterly dismissive. Jonathan snapped. He shot up from his chair, his own seat crashing backward onto the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot. He grabbed Margaret's arm, spinning her around. You don't walk away from me, he snarled. Take your hand off me, Jonathan. You ungrateful bitch! And he slapped her. It wasn't a small, cinematic slap. It was a full-force, open-handed blow, a crack of flesh and bone that echoed through the vast, suddenly silent courtyard. Margaret stumbled back, crashing into a waiter's station. Glasses shattered. Her hand flew to her cheek, where a violent red mark was already blooming. The entire gala, 300 of the most powerful people in the world, was frozen. Ruby had her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Senator Harrison looked like he was going to be sick. Jonathan stood there, breathing heavily, his chest puffed out. He was triumphant. He had finally done it. He had broken the Ice Queen. He had made the statue bleed. See, he snarled, a wild, insane look in his eyes. I'm in control. I'm the one in charge. Margaret, hand to her cheek, just stared at him. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a strange, sudden, horrifying clarity. She wasn't looking at Jonathan. She was looking just past him, toward the grand entrance of the courtyard. Are you, Jonathan? A new voice called out, cutting through the silence. The voice was calm, deep, and amplified by a chilling authority. Are you really? The voice came from the main archway. Every head in the room turned. Standing under the arch, flanked by two men in dark, sober suits who were clearly not gala guests, was Edward Whitmore. He was not a large man, but he occupied an impossible amount of space. As the Attorney General of the United States, he was the physical embodiment of the law. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, not a tuxedo. He was not here for a party. His face, which so often looked kind and scholarly on television, was now a mask of cold, controlled fury. He looked, Margaret thought, exactly like their father. Jonathan Blackwell's face, which had been flushed with triumph, turned the color of ash. The blood drained from it so fast he seemed to shrink. He didn't see his brother-in-law. He saw the nation's chief prosecutor. Ruby Lane didn't recognize him at first. She just saw a man who had brought a terrifying, crushing gravity into the room. Edward Whitmore ignored the hundreds of staring faces. He ignored the shattered glass. He ignored the gasps. His eyes were locked on only one person. He walked directly to his sister, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. He stopped in front of her, his gaze taking in the red, swelling mark on her face. He gently, almost tenderly, lifted his hand and brushed his thumb over her cheekbone, just below the injury. "Maggie," he said, his voice heartbreakingly soft. "Are you all right?" That was what broke her. Not the slap, not the humiliation, the kindness, Margaret's perfect composure, the armor she had worn for 15 years, shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. A single, choked sob escaped her. "Edward," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You came." "I always come," he said. He kept his eyes on her, but he spoke to the room. "The party's over. Please, everyone, enjoy the rest of your evening." His two aides, who were not aides but federal marshals, were already discreetly creating a perimeter. One spoke quietly into his wrist. Edward slowly turned his head. He looked at Jonathan. Jonathan was shaking. A visible, uncontrollable tremor had taken over his body. Edward, he stammered. Edward, wait, it's not what it looks like. It was a misunderstanding. She insulted me. It was a family matter. A family matter? Edward repeated. His voice was no longer soft. It was the flat, dead sound of a judge about to pass sentence. Assaulting my sister, in public, is now a family matter, Jonathan. Please, Edward, let's just go home. We can talk about this. I've had too much to drink, that's all. I've had too much to— Oh, I doubt that, Edward said, because I don't think you're drunk enough to think this is about the slap. A new, more profound terror entered Jonathan's eyes. What are you talking about? Edward looked past him, his eyes landing on the pale, trembling form of Senator Harrison. Senator, Edward said, his voice now carrying across the room again. Good to see you. I was hoping you'd be here. Senator Harrison looked like a man about to be executed. Mr. Attorney General, I was just leaving. I don't think so, Edward said. In fact, I think you're going to stay right here, because I'm sure you'll want to be a material witness when my agents arrest Senator Harrison for accepting a bribe. The senator let out a small, strangled noise. Jonathan's world tilted. No, Edward, no. Edward's gaze snapped back to Jonathan, and the force of it was physical. You thought this was about your pathetic, sordid affair? You thought I came here because you were rude to my sister? I am the Attorney General. I don't intervene in domestic disputes, even yours. He took a step closer to Jonathan, and Jonathan flinched back. I am here, Jonathan, because for the last 6 months, my office has been conducting a full-scale investigation into a bribery and money laundering scheme so vast it touches 3 committees and 2 foreign governments. A scheme that, at its very center, has you. Blackwell Industries. Ruby Lane let out a small, terrified whimper. No, Jonathan whispered. No, you're bluffing. You have nothing. It's my word against his. He pointed at Harrison. Edward almost smiled. My case was nearly complete, Jonathan. I had the offshore accounts. I had the wire transfers. I had the shell corporations routing back to Blackwell Industries, siphoning money from, among other places. He gestured to the gala around them. The Whitmore Foundation. Margaret's eyes widened in genuine shock. It was worse. So much worse. The only piece I was missing, Edward continued, his voice relentless, was a direct, overt link between you and Senator Harrison. I needed to prove the quid pro quo for the infrastructure deal. It was a good firewall, I'll give you that. Edward looked back at the terrified senator. But then, Senator Harrison, a man who has been on your payroll for 2 years, just watched you commit a violent public felony. And he did nothing. And now, he's faced with a choice. He can either be an accomplice to your bribery and an accessory to this assault, or he can testify. My agents are with his chief of staff as we speak. Edward looked back at Jonathan. Senator Harrison is cutting a deal, Jonathan. He's giving us everything. You bribing him was the one thing he witnessed tonight. Your entire case just folded. You just handed me your own king. The breath left Jonathan Blackwell's body in a single agonizing rush. It wasn't just his marriage. It wasn't just his reputation. It was everything. His money, his freedom, his entire constructed life. He stared at Edward, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. He saw the agents. He saw Harrison's ashen face. He saw Margaret standing beside her brother, her eyes no longer icy, but filled with a terrible, righteous fire. He had built his entire life on the power of the Whitmore name, using it as a shield. And now, the very source of that power had become a sword. He gasped, clutching at his chest. His $10,000 tuxedo suddenly felt like a straitjacket. The air in the room was too thick to breathe. It's over, Jonathan, Edward said. Jonathan Blackwell's legs buckled. He didn't just faint. He collapsed. He crumpled to the marble floor like a puppet with its strings cut, landing in the shattered remains of the champagne glasses. He was a heap of expensive fabric and broken pride, utterly and completely destroyed, not by the law, but by his own monstrous arrogance. The Kogod courtyard exploded into chaos. People were screaming, shouting into their phones. The flash of cameras from the press, who had pushed past the barriers, was now like a strobe light, illuminating the scene in harsh, unflattering bursts. Jonathan, unconscious on the floor. Margaret, stunned and regal. Edward, a pillar of grim justice. "Get him up," Edward ordered his marshals, his voice cutting through the din. "This isn't a medical emergency. It's a coward's faint. And get her." He pointed one steady finger at Ruby Lane, who was trying to slip away in the confusion. One of the agents, a tall woman with no-nonsense eyes, intercepted Ruby. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us, just to answer a few questions." I don't know anything," Ruby cried, all her practiced poise gone, revealing the terrified girl from West Virginia. "I'm just his associate." "We know what you are, Miss Lane," the agent said, her voice not unkind. "And that's why you're a material witness. Let's go." Jonathan was being hauled to his feet, his consciousness sputtering back. "No, get your hands off me. This is an outrage. I am. He looked at Edward, his eyes pleading. "Edward, for God's sake, she's your sister. Think of the scandal, the family name." This was his last, desperate card. The one he had played against Margaret for 15 years. Edward walked over to him. He leaned in, so only Jonathan could hear. "You dared to speak my family's name?" he whispered, his voice vibrating with a fury so cold it burned. "You put your filthy hands on my sister. You stole from her foundation. You used our name as a shield while you committed federal crimes. The scandal, Jonathan, is you. You are the cancer we are cutting out. And believe me, the Whitmores will endure. You, however, are finished." He nodded to the marshals. "Get him out of here. Use the service entrance. I don't want the press to have him yet." As Jonathan Blackwell, the kingpin of K Street, was frog-marched out of his own life, Edward turned back to his sister. The fury vanished from his face, replaced by that deep, familial concern. He gently took off his own suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders, covering the severe, beautiful dress. It was a gesture of protection, of reclaiming. "Let's go home, Maggie," he said. He guided her through the parting sea of onlookers, out the main entrance, and into the waiting, armored black government sedan. The ride to her Georgetown home, her home, she realized, not theirs, was silent. Margaret just watched the familiar streets of D.C. blur past, the lights of the monuments seeming dimmer. When they were inside the Grand Salon, the same room where Jonathan had threatened her just 24 hours earlier, the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was empty. It was over. Nadia, the assistant, was there. She had clearly been crying. "Mrs. Blackwell, oh my God, Mr. Whitmore!" "It's all right, Nadia," Edward said. "Could you make my sister some tea? With honey? The way she likes it." When she was gone, Margaret finally spoke. "You knew," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement. "You've been investigating him for 6 months. 8, Edward corrected. He sat across from her, not in the imposing chair Jonathan always used, but on the ottoman, close to her. "It started with an anonymous tip about Senator Harrison. We pulled the thread, and it just kept unraveling. It always led back to Jonathan. But he was smart. He used your foundation, your name, as a shield. He made himself too big to fail, or at least too scandalous to prosecute without burning the whole city down. So what changed?" "He got sloppy," Edward said. "He got arrogant. He started moving bigger and bigger sums. He was trying to build his own empire, free of the Whitmore name, and he started to believe his own hype. He thought he was untouchable. And the infrastructure deal was his masterpiece," Edward said with grim respect. "He was laundering money for a Russian oligarch, using the transport bill as the vehicle. He bribed Harrison to get the earmarks. He was going to skim hundreds of millions. And he was using the Whitmore Foundation's humanitarian funds as the initial clearinghouse. He was stealing from sick children, Maggie. Your sick children. Margaret closed her eyes. The infidelity was a shallow wound. This was a mortal blow. This was a betrayal of everything she was. I think I knew, she whispered, and the admission tore at her. Not this, not the specifics, but I knew he was rotten. I felt the rot spreading through this house, through my life, and I did nothing. You did what you thought you had to do, Edward said gently. You protected the legacy. You protected the foundation. You did what our father taught us to do. You held the line. And you? She looked at him. Why tonight? Why, like that? So public. Edward sighed. I wasn't planning on it. I flew back tonight to arrest him at home, quietly. I wanted to spare you, and the foundation, the public spectacle. I had the warrant. I went to the house, and Nadia, thank God, told me where you were. She said he'd taken that woman to the gala. She said she was worried. He leaned forward. When I got there, I was just going to pull you aside, but then I saw him. I saw him grab you. I saw him hit you. His voice grew thick. And in that moment, the case, the politics, the scandal, none of it mattered. All I saw was that bully from high school who used to pull your hair, and all I wanted to do was destroy him. But then, I saw Senator Harrison, right there, watching, and I realized Jonathan hadn't just slapped you. He had just handed me his own confession, gift-wrapped. He gave me my star witness. Margaret processed this. Her humiliation had been the final key. Her pain had been the trigger for his downfall. He called me a parasite, Margaret said, remembering the sting of the word. He's a projector, Maggie. He saw in you what he hated in himself. He had to tear you down to feel tall, but he's not tall. He's just a small, greedy man who flew too close to the sun. And you're the sun. Margaret looked at her brother, the U.S. Attorney General, the man who had just dismantled her life in order to save it. She managed a small, watery smile. God, Edward, she said, you always were the dramatic one. The interrogation room was beige. Everything was beige. The walls, the table, the linoleum floor. It was a room designed to suck the life out of you. And it was working on Ruby Lane. She had been sitting in the hard plastic chair for 3 hours. Her red Gucci dress was wrinkled, her makeup was smeared, and she had never felt so cheap in her entire life. Across from her sat the female agent, Special Agent Diaz, and a tired-looking man from the white-collar crime division. Let's go over this one more time, Miss Lane, Diaz said, her voice a monotone. The apartment at the wharf. Who pays the lease? I told you, he does. Jonathan. It was a gift. A bonus. A bonus of $12,000 a month? For a paralegal? That's quite a bonus. Was the BMW a bonus too? The wire transfers to your savings account, totaling over $200,000 in the last 6 months? All bonuses? Ruby was trapped. He's very generous. We believe you, the white-collar agent said, opening a file. He was also very generous with Senator Harrison. The problem is, his generosity is a federal crime, and your bonuses look an awful lot like money laundering. What? Ruby's head snapped up. No, I didn't launder anything. It was just, I was his girlfriend. Then you were the paid mistress of a man committing espionage and bribery, Diaz said flatly. That's not a great look either. But money launderer comes with a 10-year prison sentence. Girlfriend just comes with public humiliation. Ruby started to cry, ugly, gasping sobs. I didn't know, I swear to God, I didn't know about any of this. I thought he was leaving his wife. I thought he loved me. The two agents shared a look. It was the look of professionals who had seen this 100 times. He didn't love you, Miss Lane, Diaz said, not unkindly. He was using you. Just like he was using his wife. You were the weapon, she was the shield, and now you're a loose end. What do you want from me? Ruby whispered. We want everything. the white-collar agent said, pushing a legal pad toward her. "We want every conversation you overheard, every name he mentioned. We want to know about the trips to the Caymans. We want to know about the flash drive he kept in his home safe. We know you knew the combo, Ruby. We pulled the security logs from his house." Ruby's blood ran cold. He had told her the safe combo was a sign of trust. It was a test. She had a choice. She could go down with Jonathan, a loyal, idiotic concubine, and face prison. Or she could talk. She looked at the beige walls, the color of absolute despair. She thought of her trailer park in West Virginia. She thought of the disgust in Margaret Blackwell's eyes, and she thought of Jonathan, crumpled on the floor. He had no more power. He had nothing left to give her. Loyalty was a luxury she couldn't afford. "His laptop," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "He has a private laptop in his office, behind the bookshelf. It's not on the firm's network. The password is Maggie 1978, his wife's name and birth year." The agents looked at each other again. This time, it was a small, grim smile. "He's a sick man," Ruby added, the venom rising. "He was obsessed with her." "Keep talking, Miss Lane," Agent Diaz said, clicking her pen. "You're doing great." Meanwhile, Jonathan Blackwell was in a different kind of beige room. A holding cell. The $10,000 tuxedo was gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit. His lawyer, a high-priced shark named David Gersh, looked pale. "It's bad, Jonathan," Gersh said, rubbing his temples. "It's as bad as it gets." "Get me bail," Jonathan demanded, his voice hoarse. "I don't care what it costs." "Bail?" Gersh laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Jonathan, you're not getting bail. The U.S. Attorney General is personally signing the warrant. You've been designated a flight risk. And the charges, my God, the charges. Bribery of a public official, embezzlement, wire fraud, mail fraud, and, oh yes, the big one, conspiracy to defraud the United States. They're throwing the book at you." "Harrison," Jonathan stammered. "He's a coward. His word against mine." "His word, plus 6 hours of testimony from his entire staff, who are currently singing like canaries. And that's not the worst of it." "What's the worst of it?" "Ruby Lane," Gersh said. "She's in protective custody. She's giving them everything. The private laptop, the offshore accounts. She even knew about the Maggie 1978 password. You're a romantic, Jonathan, and a moron." Jonathan slammed his fist against the concrete wall. "That little—" "She's not your problem, Jonathan. Edward Whitmore is your problem. He's not just the prosecutor, he's the victim's brother. He is going to pursue this with a zeal that is almost biblical. He's going to make an example of you. He's going to bury you." "The slap," Jonathan whispered, the realization dawning. The slap. That's what did it. That's what made it personal. The slap was the dumbest thing you've ever done, and that's saying something," Gersh agreed. "You didn't just assault a woman. You assaulted the sister of the most powerful lawyer in the world in front of your key co-conspirator. It was theatrical, Jonathan. You handed them the motive, the witness, and the moral high ground all in one go." Jonathan slumped onto the thin cot. He thought of his life, the cars, the houses, the respect, the fear he commanded. It was all gone. It had all evaporated in the single echoing crack of his hand against his wife's face. He had tried to prove he was in control, and in doing so, had proven he had no control at all. "What do I do, David?" he asked, his voice that of a small, lost boy. Gersh sighed, packing his briefcase. "You plead. You take whatever deal they offer, and you pray. Because short of an act of God, you are going to spend the next 20 to 30 years in a federal penitentiary. And the worst part? The very worst part? What? The name Blackwell will be a punchline in this town for a generation. But the name Whitmore? It'll be stronger than ever. Edward Whitmore is the man who took down his own corrupt brother-in-law. He looks like a hero. Margaret looks like a martyr. And you? You're just the villain. You're the man who slapped his wife and lost the world." The scandal was, as David Gersh had predicted, biblical. It dominated the news for weeks. The Washington Post ran a front-page expose titled "The Blackwell Conspiracy: Sex, Bribes, and the Whitmore Legacy." It painted Jonathan as a sociopathic grifter and Margaret as a tragic, noble figure, a prisoner in her own home. The slap heard round the world became the defining image of the D.C. social season. Jonathan Blackwell, facing an avalanche of evidence from Ruby Lane and Senator Harrison, who pleaded guilty to lesser charges and resigned in disgrace, took a deal. He pleaded guilty to 18 counts of fraud, bribery, and embezzlement. He was sentenced to 25 years in a medium-security federal prison. Ruby Lane, given immunity for her testimony, vanished. Her name was so toxic that no firm would touch her. The last anyone heard, she had changed her name and was working as a receptionist at a dental office in Arizona, the $200,000 in bonuses having been seized by the feds. The trial, the divorce, the asset seizure. It all took nearly a year of brutal public dissection. Margaret handled it with the same grace she had handled everything else. She never gave an interview. She never made a public statement. She simply endured. And then, one day, it was over. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, a full year after the gala. Margaret was not in Georgetown. She had sold the house. The memories were too toxic, the marble too cold. She was at the Whitmore family estate in Middleburg, Virginia, a sprawling 300-acre horse farm where she and Edward had grown up. It was the only place that had ever felt like home. She was walking the fence line, dressed in old jeans, riding boots, and a worn-out flannel shirt. The air smelled of hay and apples. Her hair was down, and the wind was catching in it. The faint, silvery scar on her cheekbone was almost invisible, but she felt it every morning. A reminder. "You look good, Maggie." She turned. Edward was walking up the hill, carrying a thermos. He was in his off-duty clothes, a cable-knit sweater and corduroys. He looked less like the Attorney General and more like the big brother who used to help her with her homework. "You look tired, Ed," she said, accepting the cup of hot cider he offered. "It's been a year," he said, and they both knew he wasn't just talking about his job. "The Foundation's audit is complete. You were right." "He never touched the principal," Margaret said. "Just the interest, skimming. He was a rat, not a lion." "The board held an emergency meeting this morning. It's unanimous. You have full, unconditional control. The Whitmore Foundation is yours, Maggie, free and clear. The new charter, with the anti-corruption bylaws we drafted, is already filed." Margaret nodded, taking a sip. The cider was warm, sweet. "Good. We're liquidating the D.C. assets. We're moving the headquarters here, to the farm. We're going to focus on rural healthcare and scholarships. Get out of the D.C. swamp. Back to basics." "A good plan," Edward said. They stood in comfortable silence, watching a pair of hawks circle in the clear blue sky. "Have you heard from him?" she asked. "One letter, from prison, sent to my office. He's not adjusting well. He thinks he's the victim, a political prisoner. He's insane." "He's not insane," Margaret said quietly. "He's just empty. He was a reflection. He needed something to bounce off of. Me, my name, his power, his money. Now he's in a cell with nothing to reflect but himself. It must be torture." She looked at Edward. "Do you ever regret it? The scandal? It hurt the name." "It didn't hurt the name, Maggie," Edward said, his voice firm. "It saved it. A name, a legacy. It's not a monument, it's a garden. If you don't pull the weeds, they choke out everything. Jonathan was a weed. You and I, we're the gardeners. It's hard work, but it's good work." Margaret finished her cider and smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. She looked, in that moment, like the girl she had been, before Jonathan, before D.C., before the ice had formed. "I'm starting a new program," she said, her voice full of a new, quiet energy. "A scholarship fund for women in Appalachia. specifically for women from West Virginia who want to go to law school." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Any particular reason?" "I just think," Margaret said, a mischievous glint in her eye, "that it's important to give ambitious young women a hand up, so they don't have to rely on bonuses." Edward laughed, a full, genuine laugh that echoed across the fields. "That's my sister. And what about you, Mr. Attorney General? What's next for you?" "I'm tired of pulling weeds," he said. I think I'm going to plant something. Maybe run for office, the other office. But that's a long way off. For now, I'm just happy to be here." Margaret looped her arm through his. "Me too, Ed, me too." They walked back toward the main house, two silhouettes against the setting sun. The name Whitmore was intact. The legacy was secure. And Margaret finally, after 15 long years, was free. She had been slapped, she had been broken, she had been humiliated. But in the end, she had not just survived. She had inherited. 2 years later, the Whitmore Foundation's rural headquarters was thriving. The old carriage house had been converted into a bright, modern office, all glass and reclaimed barn wood. Margaret, now 44, was in her office, her desk overlooking a paddock where 3 retired thoroughbreds were grazing. She was wearing a simple white linen shirt, and her hair was in a loose braid. The peace she had found here was so profound, her life in Georgetown felt like a distant, vaguely unpleasant dream. Nadia, who had moved with her and was now the Foundation's COO, knocked on the open door. "Ma'am, you have a visitor." Nadia looked nervous, a look Margaret hadn't seen on her in a long time. "A visitor? I don't have anything on my schedule." "She doesn't have an appointment, but she said you'd want to see her. Her name is Ruby Lane." Margaret's blood went cold. She hadn't heard that name, hadn't thought that name, in 2 years. Her first instinct was to say no, to tell Nadia to have her removed. What could that girl possibly have to say to her? But curiosity and a strange, unwelcome flicker of pity won out. "Send her in, Nadia, and hold my calls." A moment later, Ruby Lane walked in. The change was so dramatic, Margaret almost didn't recognize her. The fire-red dress and brittle ambition were gone. This woman was 27, but looked 35. She was wearing cheap jeans, a faded t-shirt, and sneakers. Her dark hair was stringy, pulled back in an elastic band. She was painfully thin. The only thing that remained was the defiance in her eyes, though it was now mixed with a deep, desperate shame. "Mrs. Whitmore Blackwell," Ruby said. Her voice was rough. "It's just Whitmore now," Margaret said, her voice neutral. She did not stand. She did not offer a seat. "What are you doing here, Miss Lane?" I know I shouldn't be here. I know you must hate me." "Hate is a strong word," Margaret said. "It requires an energy I'm not willing to spend on you. I'm indifferent to you. Why are you here?" Ruby twisted her hands. I'm applying for something. A scholarship. The Whitmore Appalachian Law Scholarship for Women." Margaret's face remained perfectly still. Of all the things she had expected, this was not it. "You're applying to my scholarship." I'm from West Virginia," Ruby said, the words rushing out. "I grew up in a place you couldn't even imagine. I'm smart. I know I am. I got a 174 on my LSATs. I got into UVA, but I can't pay for it. After everything, I'm waitressing. I have nothing. Just debt." "And you think," Margaret said, her voice turning to ice, "that I would fund your education? The woman who tried to destroy my marriage? The woman who was with my husband?" "I know!" Ruby's voice cracked. "I know it's insane. But I read about the scholarship. It's for women like me. Women who made bad choices because they thought it was the only choice." She was crying now, silent tears of humiliation. "And I'm so tired of being the girl in the red dress. I'm so tired of being that person. I want to be a lawyer, A real one, not a bonus." Margaret looked at her. She saw the girl from the gala, the girl from the trailer park, the girl who had been used and discarded by Jonathan just as surely as she had been. She saw a fellow victim. A different kind, but a victim nonetheless. Margaret had created the scholarship out of a complex mix of pity and spite. She had wanted to save other rubies. She just never imagined the original ruby would show up at her door. "You have an incredible amount of nerve, Miss Lane," Margaret said. "I know. It's all I have left." Margaret was quiet for a long time. She looked out the window at the horses. She thought of Edward, of her father, of the legacy. A legacy wasn't just about protecting. It was about building. "You testified," Margaret said, more to herself. "You gave them the password, Maggie 1978. That's what my brother told me." Ruby flinched. He told me it was a sign of trust. I was so stupid." "Yes, you were." Margaret stood up. She walked to the window, her back to Ruby. "The scholarship committee is independent. I do not have a vote. They review the applications blind." "Oh," Ruby said, her face falling. So there's no point." She turned to leave. "I didn't say that," Margaret said, turning around. "I said I don't have a vote, but I do fund the welcome reception. I'll see you in the fall, Miss Lane, if your application is successful." Ruby stared at her, uncomprehending. "What?" "Your LSAT score is excellent. Your personal essay. I imagine it will be riveting. Don't disappoint me. And don't ever make me regret this." Ruby's mouth opened and closed. She couldn't speak. She just nodded, a look of stunned, desperate gratitude on her face. "Now get out of my office," Margaret said, her voice softening just a fraction. "I have work to do." Ruby practically ran out. Margaret sat back down at her desk. She looked at the horses, and for the first time, she felt the last tiny bit of ice around her heart melt away. Jonathan had destroyed so much. But from the ashes, she was building. She wasn't just the survivor. She was the architect, and she was, at last, in control. Millionaire left his pregnant wife with twins. 4 years later, he saw his children at a charity. He had everything: money, power, a Park Avenue penthouse. But when Michael Cavendish walked out on his pregnant wife, Lena, he never imagined he'd see the consequences of that choice reflected in 2 small faces at a children's charity event 4 years later. They had his eyes. His exact eyes. What unfolded next was not just a story of regret and redemption. It was a storm of secrets, ambition, betrayal, and ultimately, love. If you think you've heard stories of second chances, think again. This one might just break your heart and put it back together again. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see this community come together. If you enjoy powerful stories, subscribe and hit the bell. Now, let's dive in. The air in the Manhattan penthouse was like the view, clear, cold, and worth a fortune. It was the kind of air that smelled of nothing but success, filtered and conditioned to a perfect 72 degrees. Michael Cavendish, all of 29 years old, breathed it in like a drug. His reflection stared back at him from the floor-to-ceiling window that framed the glittering, indifferent skyline of New York City. He wasn't just looking at himself. He was looking at the man Forbes had just canonized in their 30 Under 30 issue, the co-founder of Neurotech, a company poised to revolutionize human-computer interfaces. The headline, "The Architect of Tomorrow," was still ringing in his ears. He ran a hand through his meticulously styled dark hair, the weight of a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit resting on his shoulders. Everything in his life was custom-tailored: his suits, his schedule, his future. And the architect of that future, more so than himself, was Evelyn Harrington. The chime of his phone was crisp and demanding. It was Evelyn. "The Tokyo Consortium is in," she said, her voice devoid of pleasantries. It was a scalpel, designed to cut straight to the point. 100 million, Series C. The valuation is triple what we projected. Michael's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a gilded cage. "Evelyn, that's monumental." "It is," she agreed, a rare sliver of something almost like warmth in her tone. "But they're not just investing in the tech, Michael. They're investing in the narrative. The brilliant, unencumbered young visionary. They want a clean image. No baggage, no distractions." He knew what she meant. Evelyn, his mentor, and the primary investor who had plucked him from obscurity, had always preached a gospel of ruthless focus. Love, family, attachments, they were liabilities in the ledger of ambition. She was a woman carved from ice and stock options, and she was the reason he was standing in this penthouse instead of coding in a cramped apartment. "I understand," he said, his gaze drifting to the door of the art studio he'd had built for his wife in a corner of the sprawling apartment. "No distractions." "Good. I'll send the preliminary paperwork. Don't be late for the press dinner tonight." The line went dead. Michael slid the phone onto the marble countertop and walked towards the studio. The faint, familiar scent of turpentine and linseed oil met him at the door, a scent that was once his comfort, his anchor to a world outside of algorithms and boardrooms. It was the scent of Lena Rivera Cavendish. A name that felt like a poem in his mouth, a splash of vibrant color in his monochromatic world. She was a brilliant artist from Brooklyn, a woman whose talent burned with a ferocity that both captivated and unnerved him. He'd met her at a gallery opening where her work, bold, emotional, chaotic canvases, had been relegated to a back wall, overshadowed by more commercial pieces. He saw the genius she possessed, even if the world hadn't yet. He'd pursued her with the same single-minded intensity he applied to his business, promising her the world. And for a time, he had given it to her. He pushed the door open. Lena was standing in the center of the room, not painting. Her back was to him, her hands clasped behind her. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing around her like tiny lost stars. She looked small against the backdrop of a massive, unfinished canvas. "Lena," he said softly. She turned, and the breath caught in his throat. Her face, usually a landscape of expressive features, was pale and etched with a fragile, terrifying joy. Her dark, curly hair was pulled back, emphasizing the deep, soulful brown eyes that had first captured him. But it was her smile that stopped him. It was wide, trembling, and aimed directly at him. "Michael," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. She took a step towards him, her hands moving from behind her back to rest protectively over her stomach. "We did it." He blinked, confused. "Did what? Did you sell a piece?" Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, before roaring back to life. "No, something better. The doctor called an hour ago." She paused, savoring the moment, letting the tension build into a crescendo of pure happiness. "Michael, I'm pregnant." The words hit him like a physical blow. Pregnant. It was a word they had chased for 2 agonizing years, a word whispered in hushed tones after every negative test, a word that had become synonymous with failure and heartache. They had been told it was unlikely, a near impossibility. And now, a slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, uncalculated reaction that felt foreign. You're sure?" "I'm sure," she whispered, tears finally breaking free and tracing paths down her cheeks. The fertility treatments, the last round, it worked. He rushed forward, sweeping her into his arms and lifting her off the ground. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her, the scent of home. For a single, perfect moment. The Tokyo Consortium, the Series C funding, the Forbes article. It all dissolved into meaningless noise. This was real. This was life. He set her down gently, his hands tracing the curve of her waist, trying to imagine the new life blooming within. "A baby," he murmured, the word feeling clumsy and miraculous on his tongue. Lena's expression shifted, the joy deepening into something more profound, more awesome. "Not just a baby, my love." She took his hand and placed it flat against her still flat abdomen. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, filled with wonder. "Michael, it's twins." Twins! The word echoed in the vast, silent space of the penthouse. It wasn't a word of joy. It was an alarm bell. It was the sound of a carefully constructed future shattering into a million pieces. Twins. Not one distraction, but two. Not a quiet addition to his narrative, but a chaotic, demanding, all-consuming plot twist. The image of Evelyn's face flashed in his mind. Her words sharp and clear. No baggage, no distractions. He felt the blood drain from his face. The genuine smile he'd worn just moments ago felt like a mask that was now cracking. He slowly pulled his hand away from Lena's stomach, as if it were burning him. Lena saw the shift instantly. Her own smile faltered, the light in her eyes dimming. "Michael, what is it?" He couldn't look at her. He turned away, walking back towards the window, towards the view of the empire he was building. The city lights were beginning to flicker on, a galaxy of ambition that he was so close to conquering. "Michael, talk to me," she pleaded, her voice losing its joyful lilt and taking on a familiar edge of anxiety. "The timing," he began, his voice a low rasp. "Lena, the timing is just... it's not good." "Not good?" She let out a laugh that was half sob, half disbelief. "We've been praying for this for years. We went through hell for this. How can it be not good?" He turned to face her, his expression hardening into a mask of cold logic, the face he wore in the boardroom. "I just closed the biggest funding round of my career. The investors, they expect a certain commitment. My undivided attention. And you think being a father is a distraction?" she asked, her voice rising. "You think our children are a distraction?" "It's not that simple," he shot back, the pressure building in his chest. "This is a critical phase. It's the launch. It's the IPO in 2 years. It's everything we've worked for." "You've worked for," she corrected, her voice now dangerously quiet. "I've been here, supporting you, putting my own career on hold, creating a home for you to come back to when you're done changing the world. I've been building a life, Michael. I thought we were building it together." Her words were arrows, each one finding its mark in the hollow space where his conscience used to be. He knew she was right. But Evelyn's voice was louder, a siren song of success that drowned out everything else. Unencumbered. Clean image. "Lena, I can't do this right now," he said, the words tasting like ash. The color drained from her face, leaving her stark white. "Can't do what?" "Can't do what, Michael? Be a father? Be my husband?" He ran a hand over his face, the weight of his decision crushing him. He was standing at a precipice. On one side was the life he had, the cold, clear air of success. On the other was a messy, unpredictable, beautiful life with Lena and their children. He saw 2 paths, and in his moment of supreme weakness, he chose the one that led up, not the one that led home. "I think," he started, his voice cracking. "I think I need some space. I need to focus." Lena stared at him, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. It was a look of such profound betrayal that it would be seared into his memory for years, a ghost that would haunt him in his quietest, most successful moments. No, she whispered, shaking her head in denial. No, you don't mean that. You're just scared. We can do this. I'll handle everything. It won't affect your work, I promise. She was begging now, her pride dissolving in a desperate attempt to hold their world together. Michael, please, don't do this to me. Don't do this to them. Her hand went to her stomach, a gesture of pure primal protection. It was that gesture that broke him, that solidified his terrible resolve. He couldn't look at her, at the future she was holding. He was a coward, and he chose the coward's way out. He walked to the bedroom, pulled a suitcase from the cavernous walk-in closet, and began mechanically packing. Shirts, suits, the symbols of his chosen life. He could feel her presence in the doorway, watching him, her silence a roaring condemnation. When he was done, he walked past her without a word, heading for the front door. Michael? Her voice was a raw scream of pain. He stopped, his hand on the cool metal of the doorknob, his back to her. If you walk out that door, she said, her voice trembling but gaining a sliver of steel, don't ever come back. You won't just be leaving me. You will be leaving your children. You will be a ghost to them. Do you understand? He understood. He understood the enormity of what he was doing. And yet, he couldn't stop himself. The allure of the narrative, the brilliant, unencumbered visionary, was too strong. He pulled the door open. I'm sorry, Lena, he whispered to the empty hallway. He stepped out and pulled the door closed. The final soft click echoed in the hallway, a sound of absolute finality. Inside, the silence of the penthouse descended upon Lena. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Her legs gave out from under her, and she crumpled to the polished marble floor. She wrapped her arms tightly around her stomach, a silent promise to the two lives nestled within her. The scream that had been building in her chest finally erupted, but it was soundless, a violent, tearing agony that ripped through her soul. In the vast, opulent emptiness of the home they had built, the silence was louder and more terrifying than any noise could ever be. She was utterly and completely alone. Part 2. The Disappearance. The Manhattan penthouse was a universe away. Lena's new world was a third-floor walk-up in Astoria, Queens, the neighborhood where she had grown up, a place that smelled of roasted street nuts, exhaust fumes, and her mother's arroz con gandules. The rejection and public humiliation were a cloak she wore, heavy and suffocating. News of their separation had been a brief, salacious item in the gossip columns, a footnote in the epic of Michael Cavendish's ascent. Tech mogul splits from artist wife, the headlines read, painting her as a casualty of his ambition. They were right. She moved back into her family's orbit, a constellation of loud, loving, and fiercely protective aunts, uncles, and cousins who buffered her from the sharpest edges of her pain. They never spoke of Michael. To them, he was a name that had been erased from their history. Her pregnancy was difficult, marked by morning sickness that lasted all day and a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that had as much to do with her broken heart as it did with the two lives she was growing. There were nights she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, one hand on her burgeoning belly, feeling the flutter of two distinct movements, a tiny foot here, a hiccup there. In those moments, the loneliness was a physical presence in the room. She gave birth in the middle of a sweltering July heat wave to two beautiful, tiny girls. The first, Sophia, came into the world with a loud, indignant cry, her eyes wide open, taking in everything. She had Lena's dark, curly hair and her fiery spirit. The second, Luna, arrived 5 minutes later, silent and serene. She was a mirror image of her sister, but her eyes, a startling shade of crystalline blue, were all Michael's. From the moment she was born, Luna was different. She rarely cried. She watched the world with a calm, unnerving intensity, as if she were processing it on a level no one else could understand. Lena's art had been her voice, but now it became her salvation. The pain of Michael's betrayal was a raw, gaping wound. Instead of letting it fester, she poured it onto canvas. But these weren't the pieces she would sell. These were for her. They were dark, chaotic, and filled with a grief so palpable it seemed to bleed from the paint. When the girls were 6 months old, the money she'd saved from the few paintings she'd sold before Michael was running low. Humility was a lesson she was learning daily. She found a job, not in a chic Soho gallery, but as an art therapist at a small, struggling nonprofit in her neighborhood called Hands of Hope. The center catered to underprivileged and disabled children, offering them a sanctuary where they could express themselves through art. It was there, surrounded by the vibrant, messy, and uninhibited creativity of these children, that Lena began to heal. She saw how a splash of yellow paint could bring a smile to the face of a child who had seen too much darkness. She saw how molding clay could give a sense of control to a child whose life was anything but. She was good at it. She was brilliant. She found a purpose that had nothing to do with gallery openings or critical acclaim. Her life became a quiet routine of motherhood and work. Mornings were a whirlwind of diapers, bottles, and coaxing Sophia to eat her strained peas. Days were spent at Hands of Hope, her own daughters often playing in a quiet corner of the studio. Evenings were for them. She would read them stories, her voice soft, creating a world for them free of ghosts. Sometimes, she would sit in the small nursery she had painted herself. The walls were a soft, sunny yellow. On one wall, she had painted a sprawling tree with 2 little birds nestled in its branches. She would hold up the 2 tiny dresses she had bought when she first found out she was having girls, one pink, one blue. She'd press them to her face, the fabric still smelling of the department store, and whisper to her sleeping daughters. "I'm so sorry," she would say, tears tracking silently down her face. "I'm sorry for the father you'll never know, but I promise you, you will always be loved. You will always be enough." Meanwhile, across the river, Michael Cavendish skyrocketed. Neurotech's IPO was a phenomenal success, making him a billionaire before his 30th birthday. He was no longer just in Forbes, he was on the cover of Time, Wired, The Wall Street Journal. His life was a blur of private jets, keynote speeches in Tokyo and Berlin, and a rotating cast of supermodels and actresses on his arm. He became a tabloid favorite, his face splashed across magazines at the checkout counter, a symbol of a new generation of untouchable tech royalty. He built a fortress around his heart. He told himself that Lena, resilient and strong, had moved on. He convinced himself that maybe, just maybe, the stress of the breakup had... He could never finish the thought. The idea that she had lost the baby was a convenient, monstrous lie he allowed himself to believe because the alternative was too painful to confront. He never reached out. He never asked. It was easier to believe she had disappeared, that chapter of his life was simply over. The guilt was a low hum beneath the roar of his success, a frequency he could ignore as long as he kept moving, as long as he kept climbing. He was the architect of tomorrow, and tomorrow had no room for yesterday's mistakes. He was rich, powerful, and admired by the world, and he had never been more alone. 4 years passed like this. 4 years of building an empire on a foundation of regret. 4 years of Lena rebuilding a life from the ashes of his betrayal. 4 years of Sophia growing into a bright, chatty, inquisitive little girl. And Luna, her silent, watchful shadow, who had yet to speak a single word. The doctors had a name for Luna's quiet world: autism spectrum disorder. For Lena, it was just Luna, her beautiful, mysterious, perfect daughter. The 2 girls were her entire universe, a world Michael Cavendish had no idea even existed. Part 3. The Reunion. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of glittering diamonds and tailored tuxedos. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto tables laden with floral arrangements and ridiculously small appetizers. The air was thick with the murmur of polite, powerful conversation, the language of money, influence, and performative philanthropy. This was the annual fundraising gala for the Hands of Hope Children's Foundation, an event that had, through sheer force of will from its new board members, become a staple on the Manhattan charity circuit. Michael Cavendish stood near the bar, a glass of champagne in his hand that he had no intention of drinking. He felt a familiar sense of detachment, the same ennui that accompanied him to every one of these functions. They were obligations, strategic appearances. This one was Evelyn's pet project. Now his full business partner and COO of Neuratech, Evelyn had taken a sudden interest in philanthropy, specifically this small, upstart foundation from Queens. It was good for the brand, she'd said. Corporate responsibility with a human touch. "Mingle, Michael," Evelyn hissed, appearing at his side like a phantom in a silver Carolina Herrera gown. Her smile was a slash of red lipstick, tight and predatory. "You look like you're waiting for a bus. The mayor is over by the silent auction. Go look interested." "I'm donating $1 million, Evelyn," Michael said, his voice flat. "I think that shows sufficient interest." "Donating is easy," she countered, her eyes scanning the room. "Presence is power. Go." He sighed, handing his untouched champagne to a passing waiter. He made his way through the throng of people, nodding, smiling, shaking hands, his public persona clicking into place like armor. He drifted towards the art wall, a large display set up to showcase the work of the children from the Hands of Hope Center. It was a chaotic explosion of color, finger paintings, clay sculptures, and crayon drawings. It was supposed to be the heart of the event, a reminder of the cause, but most of the guests flowed past it, more interested in the open bar. And then he saw them. They were sitting on a small bench in front of the wall, away from the main crowd, two little girls who were the spitting image of each other. They each had a large sketch pad on their laps and were drawing with intense concentration. They couldn't have been more than 4 years old. They both had wild, dark curls tied back with matching blue ribbons. They wore identical navy blue velvet dresses. One girl was chattering away to the other, pointing at her drawing. The other was silent, her focus absolute, her small hand moving a crayon across the paper with deliberate strokes. Michael stopped. It wasn't just their identical appearance that held him captive. It was something in their faces, a familiarity that struck him like a physical blow. He moved closer, a strange magnetic pull drawing him in. The chattering girl looked up, her train of thought interrupted by his shadow falling over her. She smiled, a bright, gap-toothed grin. "Hi," she said, and then he saw it. In the quiet girl, who lifted her head a moment later. Her eyes. They were his eyes, the same crystalline blue, a shade so distinct it had been a defining feature his entire life. They were looking at him from the face of this tiny, silent child. The world tilted on its axis. The polite chatter of the gala. The clinking of glasses. The soft music. It all faded into a roaring silence. He could hear nothing but the frantic, panicked drumming of his own heart. It couldn't be. It was impossible. A lie he had told himself for 4 years, shattered in an instant. She moved on. Maybe she lost the baby. He sank to his haunches, his expensive suit creasing, his mind struggling to process the information his eyes were feeding him. "Hello," he managed to say, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What are your names?" The talkative one puffed out her chest proudly. "I'm Sophia, and this is my sister Luna." She pointed to the silent girl who just watched him, her blue eyes wide and unblinking. Sophia and Luna. The names felt like ghosts on his tongue. He had never heard them before, yet they felt like a part of him. "Those are beautiful drawings," he said, his gaze fixed on Luna. Her drawing was a series of intricate swirling patterns, all in shades of blue. His eyes. "Thank you," a voice said from behind him, a voice that froze the blood in his veins. Time stopped. He had heard that voice in his dreams, in his nightmares, in the quiet moments of regret he so fiercely denied. He rose slowly, turning as if in a trance. And there she was, Lina Rivera. She was different, yet entirely the same. The years had sharpened the soft lines of her face, giving her a new, formidable elegance. She wore a simple, dark green dress that highlighted the strength in her shoulders and the grace in her posture. Her hair was pulled back, and her eyes, those deep, soulful brown eyes, held a universe of emotions he couldn't begin to decipher. There was pain, yes, but there was also a steely resilience, a poise that unnerved him. The storm he saw in her eyes was contained, controlled, making it all the more terrifying. "Lina," he breathed. The name was an admission, a confession, a prayer. Her expression didn't change. There was no shock, no outburst, just a cool, level acknowledgement. "Michael, I wondered if I'd see you here, publicly cornered." His mind reeled. The people, the noise, it all came rushing back. He was Michael Cavendish, the tech visionary. He was supposed to be in control. But he was stumbling, drowning in the flood of a past he had tried to bury. "These are," he started, his voice cracking as he gestured helplessly towards the girls. "My daughters," Lina finished for him, her voice calm and even. She walked to the girls, placing a protective hand on each of their shoulders. Sophia immediately leaned into her. Luna remained focused on him, her gaze unwavering. "They have my eyes," he whispered, the words a statement of impossible fact. Lena's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. "They get that from their father." The words were a quiet, devastating blow, delivered with surgical precision. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't crying. She was stating a fact. And the coldness of it was worse than any rage. He needed to get her away from the crowd. Can we talk? Somewhere private?" She considered him for a moment before giving a single, sharp nod. She whispered something to Sophia, who then took Luna's hand. An older woman with a kind face, Lena's mother, he vaguely recognized, appeared and led the girls away. Lena led him to a small, deserted balcony overlooking the dark expanse of Central Park. The cool night air did nothing to calm the fire in his veins. As soon as they were alone, his composure shattered. "They're mine," he said, the words raw, accusatory. "They're my daughters. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you disappear?" Lena finally let a sliver of the storm show. A bitter, mirthless smile touched her lips. "Tell you? I seem to recall the last time I told you something. You walked out the door. You made your choice, Michael. You chose the clean narrative, the unencumbered life. This," she gestured vaguely back towards the ballroom, "is my life. You don't get to be a part of it." "I have a right," he insisted, his voice rising with desperation. "I have a right to know my children." "You lost that right the day you walked away from them," she shot back, her voice still low but now laced with steel. "You don't have rights, Michael. You have opportunities, and you threw yours away. For 4 years, I have been their mother and their father. I have stayed up with them through fevers. I have kissed their scraped knees. I have held them when they had nightmares. I painted a nursery alone. I celebrated their first birthdays alone. Where were you? You were on the cover of magazines. You don't get to swoop in now at a charity gala and demand a place in their lives because you're feeling a pang of guilt." Every word was a nail in his coffin. He had no defense. He knew she was right. He sagged against the railing, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a hollow, aching cavern of regret. "Lena, I didn't know. I thought—" "What did you think?" she asked, her voice genuinely curious now. "That I just vanished? That the pregnancy just vanished? It was easier for you that way, wasn't it? To not ask, to not know, to tell yourself whatever story you needed to so you could sleep at night in your penthouse." He couldn't answer. He could only stare at her, at the woman he had wronged so profoundly. For the first time in 4 years, a feeling washed over him that was deeper and more real than the fleeting high of a successful IPO or the adrenaline of a new deal. It wasn't just guilt. It was a regret so profound it felt like a physical illness, a cancer in his soul. He had not just made a mistake. He had committed a sin against the only thing that had ever truly mattered. As he stood there, stripped bare by her words and his own crushing realization, Evelyn walked out onto the balcony, her silver dress shimmering. "Everything all right?" she asked, her gaze flicking between Michael's shattered expression and Lena's rigid composure. She looked at Lena, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Ms. Rivera, I'm Evelyn Harrington. I'm a great admirer of your foundation's work." Lena's focus shifted to Evelyn, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Thank you, Miss Harrington. Your support is greatly appreciated. In fact, it's crucial." "Crucial?" Michael asked, latching onto the word, desperate for a way to fix this, to do something. Lena looked back at him, her expression unreadable. "Hands of Hope is about to lose its lease. We've been operating on a shoestring budget for years. Your generous donation tonight is a lifeline, but it's a temporary one. We need a permanent solution, a long-term benefactor, or we'll have to close our doors in 6 months." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. A cruel twist of fate. The charity he was here to support, the one Evelyn had chosen for its PR value, was Lena's life's work. It was at risk of disappearing. And he, the man who had destroyed her life, was the only one with the power to save it. He had the money. He had the influence. He could write a check and solve her problem. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was a debt that could never be repaid with money. Part 4. Redemption and Secrets. The power to save Hands of Hope sat in his bank account, a string of meaningless numbers. But writing a check felt like a continuation of the same mistake he'd always made, trying to solve a human problem with money. It was an insult to what Lena had built, a hollow gesture. He needed to understand. He needed to earn his way back, not buy it. The following Monday, a man named Mike showed up to volunteer at the Hands of Hope Center in Queens. He wore jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He told the harried volunteer coordinator he was new to the neighborhood and had some free time. No one recognized the billionaire from the cover of Time magazine. No one except Lena. She saw him the moment he walked in, her heart lurching into her throat. She watched from the doorway of her small office as he was handed a bucket and a mop and pointed towards a paint-spattered floor. She expected him to balk, to make an excuse and leave. He didn't. He just nodded and started mopping, his movements awkward at first, then settling into a steady rhythm. She decided to let the charade play out. Let him see what this world was really like, far from the galas and boardrooms. Let him scrub the floors and clean the paintbrushes and see the leaky pipes in the ceiling. Michael, or Mike, threw himself into the work. He unclogged toilets, fixed broken easels, and organized the chaotic art supply closet. He listened more than he spoke, observing the controlled chaos of the center. He saw the worn-out furniture, the second-hand supplies, the look of exhaustion and fierce dedication on the faces of the staff. And he saw the children. He saw their unvarnished joy, their struggles, their resilience. This place was more than a charity. It was a sanctuary. It was a home. He kept his distance from the twins, terrified of overwhelming them. He watched them from afar. Sophia was a social butterfly, flitting from group to group, her laughter echoing through the halls. Luna was her own quiet island. She would sit in a corner of the main art room, her sketchbook her only companion, her blue eyes taking in everything. She didn't speak, not to the other children, not to the teachers, not even to Sophia. She communicated through her drawings, intricate worlds of color and shape. One afternoon, Michael was tasked with cleaning the art room. Luna was there, sitting at her usual small table. The other children had gone outside to play. He moved quietly, wiping down tables, his gaze continually drifting back to her. He noticed a box of brand-new, high-quality pastels sitting on a high shelf, still in their plastic wrap, a luxury in this place of meager resources. He took them down and approached her table hesitantly. He didn't say a word. He simply opened the box and placed it beside her sketchbook. Her eyes, those startlingly familiar blue eyes, flicked from the pastels to his face. There was no fear, just a quiet curiosity. He pulled up a small chair, took out a spare piece of paper, and picked up a piece of charcoal. He began to draw, not looking at her, just sketching the patterns of light coming through the dusty window. After a few minutes, he felt a small movement beside him. Luna had picked up a deep blue pastel. She didn't look at him, but on her own page, she began to draw. They sat there for nearly an hour, side by side in companionable silence, communicating not with words, but with color and line. He drew the world outside the window. She drew the world inside her head. In that silence, he felt a connection purer and more profound than any conversation he'd ever had. It was the first time he felt like a father. Lena watched the entire exchange from the doorway of her office, her arms crossed over her chest. A war raged within her. The part of her that had been so deeply wounded screamed that this was a trick, a performance. But the part of her that was a mother, the part that saw the quiet, patient man sitting with her silent daughter, felt the ice around her heart begin to crack. He wasn't trying to force a connection. He was meeting Luna in her world, on her terms. His resolve softening, she found herself re-examining the past. She thought about his cowardice, his weakness. It was inexcusable, but was it entirely his own? The name that kept surfacing in her mind was Evelyn Harrington. A few days later, driven by a new, burning curiosity, Lena found herself in the main office, digging through old financial records. Hands of Hope had nearly closed its doors 3 years ago before an anonymous donation had appeared, enough to cover the rent for a full year. The wire transfer was from a shell corporation, but the contact email listed was for a personal assistant. On a hunch, Lena looked up the name. The assistant worked for a private art broker, one of the most exclusive in the city. Lena's blood ran cold. She went home that night and pulled a dusty portfolio from the back of her closet. Inside was the documentation for a single painting she had sold 3.5 years ago. It was a massive, fiery canvas she had painted in the depths of her despair, a piece she considered her masterpiece. Desperate for money to keep the center afloat, she had sold it through a broker under a pseudonym she'd used in college, L. Rivera. The sale had been anonymous, the buyer unknown. The amount was exactly what the charity had received. The buyer hadn't been a random art lover. The buyer had been Michael's company, or more specifically, Evelyn's. She hadn't just known about the charity, she had known about Lena's personal sacrifice. The next day, Lena walked into the gleaming, sterile lobby of Neuratech headquarters in Manhattan. She didn't have an appointment, but she radiated an authority that receptionists were not trained to question. She was on Evelyn Harrington's floor in minutes, Evelyn was sitting behind a vast desk of glass and steel, the city glittering behind her. She didn't look surprised to see Lena. "Miss Rivera," Evelyn said, her voice smooth as silk. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Cut the act, Evelyn," Lena said, her voice low and steady. "You bought my painting 3 years ago. You knew I was using the money to save the charity." Evelyn leaned back, a small, knowing smile on her face. "It was a brilliant piece, an excellent investment. And you knew about the twins," Lena continued, her voice gaining strength. "All along, didn't you?" The smile didn't falter. "Michael receives hundreds of pieces of correspondence a week. Personal matters are filtered by my office. It's a matter of efficiency." The world seemed to slow down. "Filtered?" Lena repeated, her heart pounding. "I wrote to him, after the girls were born. I sent pictures. I told him their names. I told him I was scared, and I needed him." The confession was ripped from her, a secret shame she had buried for years. She had swallowed her pride and reached out, and had been met with nothing but silence. "As I said," Evelyn replied coolly, "distractions are bad for business. Michael was on the verge of greatness. He needed to be focused, not bogged down by domestic complications. I made an executive decision. I protected my investment." Lena stared at the woman, a creature of pure, unadulterated ambition. Evelyn hadn't just manipulated Michael with words. She had actively conspired to keep him from his children, hiding the letters, erasing Lena's attempts to bridge the chasm between them. The anger Lena expected to feel was there, but it was overshadowed by a sudden, startling clarity. She had spent 4 years building a narrative in her head with Michael as the sole, monstrous villain. The truth was more complex, and in some ways, more tragic. She walked out of the office without another word and drove straight to the center. Michael was in the yard, helping some of the kids build a lopsided birdhouse. He looked up as she approached, a question in his eyes. "We need to talk," she said. They sat on the same small bench where he had first seen his daughters. "I went to see Evelyn," Lena began, her gaze fixed on the children playing in the distance. She told him everything, about the letters he never received, about the photos he never saw, about the painting she sold, and how Evelyn had known all along. Michael listened, his face paling, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror, and finally to a quiet, soul-crushing devastation. The fortress he had built around himself, the careful logic and justifications, crumbled to dust. He had not just been a coward, he had been a fool. A puppet whose strings were pulled by the very person he thought was his greatest champion. He looked at Lena, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. I never knew," he whispered. "Lena, I swear to you, I never knew." "I know," she said softly. And the most surprising thing was, she did. She looked at this man, covered in sawdust and a little bit of finger paint, and she saw him for the first time in years. Not the monster, not the mogul. Just a man who had made a terrible choice, amplified by the machinations of a woman who saw people as pawns. "You were never the villain, Michael," she said, the words feeling heavy and true. The anger had finally dissipated, replaced by a profound, weary sadness for all the years they had lost. "But you let people write the story for you. You let them build your life, and you never stopped to read the fine print." Part 5. The Choice. The fine print of his life had come due. The revelation of Evelyn's deception didn't absolve him. It condemned him in a new and more profound way. He had been so blinded by ambition, so desperate for her approval, that he had willingly ceded his own moral compass. The weight of that complicity was heavier than any empire. Just as this new reality was settling in, their fragile, tentative world was rocked again. Lena collapsed at the center one afternoon, overcome by a wave of dizziness and pain. The health issues that had plagued her before her pregnancy, a chronic autoimmune condition, had been dormant for years. The stress and emotional turmoil had triggered a severe flare-up. Her doctors were blunt. She needed rest, a significant reduction in stress, and likely surgery. Suddenly, Michael was no longer a volunteer playing at redemption. He was the only parent available. Lena, weak but resolute, laid out the rules from her hospital bed. "You'll stay at my apartment. My mother will be there to help. You will follow the girls' routine to the letter. You listen to them. You pay attention. This isn't about you, Michael. It's about them." He nodded, terrified and determined. "I understand." He stepped into the vibrant, chaotic, and loving world Lena had built. It was a world of mismatched socks, glitter glued to the kitchen table, and a calendar crowded with playdates and therapy appointments. It was the antithesis of his sterile penthouse. For the first time, he experienced real fatherhood. The nights were sleepless. Sophia had a nightmare about a monster under her bed, and he found himself sitting on the floor of her room at 3 a.m., whispering assurances until her breathing evened out. The mornings were messy. He learned that Sophia would only eat her oatmeal if it had a smiley face drawn in it with raisins, and that Luna, while she wouldn't eat much, needed her orange juice in a specific blue cup, or she would silently refuse to drink it. He drove them to the center, which now felt like his responsibility too. He sat in on Luna's sessions with her occupational therapist, learning the subtle cues of her silent language. He discovered that her intricate drawings weren't random. They were maps of her emotions. Swirling blues meant calm, while jagged reds meant frustration. He learned to read her better than any stock market report. He was in the middle of a particularly messy art project, an attempt to build a volcano out of papier-mâché that looked more like a brown lump, when he felt a small tug on his sleeve. It was Luna. She was holding up her drawing tablet, on which she had drawn a picture. It was a simple stick figure of a man with wild, dark hair, holding hands with two smaller stick figures. All three were smiling. He felt a lump form in his throat. Later that afternoon, as they were cleaning up, she did something she had never done before. She walked up to him, wrapped her small arms around his legs, and gave him a brief, tight hug before walking away, as if nothing had happened. It was a silent hug, but it spoke volumes. It felt more valuable than the $100 million funding round that had cost him everything. Lena's mother, Maria, watched him with skeptical eyes that slowly softened. One evening, after the girls were asleep, she found him in the kitchen, scrubbing dried paint off the floor. "She did all this by herself, you know," Maria said, her voice quiet. "She built this life for them with her 2 hands and a broken heart. Don't you dare break it again." "I won't," Michael said, meeting her gaze. "I know what I lost. I'm never letting it go again." His old life felt like a distant dream. He ignored the frantic calls and texts from his office. Neurotech, the company that had been his entire identity, was a phantom limb. The only thing that felt real was the weight of Sophia's head on his shoulder as they read a bedtime story, the quiet presence of Luna drawing beside him. But the old life was not done with him. Evelyn Harrington showed up at Lena's apartment unannounced. She looked utterly out of place, a hawk in a canary's cage, her sharp couture a stark contrast to the comfortable, lived-in clutter. "This has gone on long enough, Michael," she said, her voice a low hiss, ignoring Maria, who stood sentinel by the door. "The board is getting nervous. Your little sabbatical is making us look unstable." "This is not a sabbatical, Evelyn. This is my life," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Don't be sentimental. It's unbecoming," she sneered. "I'm here to give you a choice. The Kenjutsu merger is on the table. This is the deal that makes Neurotech a global titan. It makes us legends. But they are a conservative company. They want stability. They want the visionary, not the beleaguered single dad with a charity case attached to him." She placed a thick folder on the kitchen table. "The deal closes at the Hands of Hope Gala tomorrow night. It's a perfect PR opportunity. You will be there. You will announce the merger. You will cut ties with this situation. You will walk back into your life, the one we built, or you can stay here and play house. And I will invoke the key man clause in your contract. I will paint you as an unstable and unreliable leader to the board. I will push you out. The merger will proceed, and Nuratech will be mine. Your choice. Your empire, or them." It was the same choice she had given him 4 years ago, cloaked in different terms. Success or family, ambition or love. The old Michael, the boy who craved validation and feared failure, would have taken the deal in a heartbeat. But he was not the old Michael. He had scrubbed floors and cleaned paintbrushes. He had learned the language of silent hugs and raisin-faced oatmeal. He looked at Evelyn, at her cold, calculating eyes, and he felt nothing but pity for her. The next night was the gala. The ballroom was even more opulent than the year before. Michael stood on the stage, the lights hot, the room full of the most powerful people in the city. Evelyn was in the front row, a triumphant smile on her face. She thought she had won. He stepped up to the microphone. "Good evening," he began, his voice clear and strong, echoing through the silent hall. "A year ago, I stood in a room like this, a man who had everything and valued nothing. I was the co-founder of Nuratech, a company I believed was my greatest legacy." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, finding Lena sitting at a table in the back. She was out of the hospital, looking pale but beautiful, her eyes fixed on him. "I was wrong," he continued. "My legacy is not in a stock portfolio or a global merger. My legacy is in the quiet moments we so often overlook." He looked directly at Evelyn. "I was recently presented with a choice: to secure a massive business deal that would solidify my company's place in the world, or to honor the commitments I failed to make years ago, to choose my empire or to choose my family." A gasp rippled through the room. Evelyn's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "My choice is clear," Michael said, his voice ringing with conviction. "There is no deal in the world worth more than the people I left behind. There is no success worth the cost of your soul. Tonight, I am not here to announce a merger. I am here to announce my resignation from Nuratech." He let the words hang in the stunned silence. "And I am also here to make a promise. The Hands of Hope Foundation will not close its doors. It will have a new home, a new building with all the resources it needs to continue its incredible work, funded in perpetuity." He didn't need Nuratech's money for that. He still had his own. He looked back at Evelyn. He saw the truth in her eyes now. She had never believed in him, only in what he could build for her. This was her plan all along, to use him to build the company, and then to oust him when he was no longer convenient. She thought she was taking his empire. He knew the truth. He was walking away with his dignity, his honor, and the only thing that had ever truly mattered. He had lost his company, but he had found himself. Part 6. The Healing. The months that followed were a quiet, deliberate reconstruction. The tabloid headlines exploded with news of Michael Cavendish's spectacular fall from grace. "Tech titan implodes," they screamed. "Billionaire walks away from empire." He ignored it all. His world had shrunk to the size of a small apartment in Queens, and for the first time, it felt big enough. Lena recovered slowly but steadily from her surgery. Michael was a constant presence, not as a desperate man seeking forgiveness, but as a partner. He learned to braid Sophia's unruly hair, a task that required the concentration of a bomb disposal expert. He sat with Luna for hours, the two of them filling sketchbooks with their silent conversations. He cooked, he cleaned, he was simply present. The Hands of Hope Foundation, true to his word, thrived. A new building was purchased and renovated, a bright, airy space with state-of-the-art equipment and a sunny outdoor playground. The funding came from a newly established trust, its sole benefactor listed as Emma Rivera. A quiet tribute to the woman who had started it all with a single, selfless act. Michael, stripped of his corporate identity, found a new purpose. He poured his energy and a significant portion of his remaining fortune into launching a new tech initiative. It wasn't flashy or designed to disrupt markets. It was a small company focused on creating affordable, intuitive communication tools and therapy apps for children with autism and other developmental disorders. He named it Lunatech. His work was no longer about changing the world. It was about changing a world, for one child at a time. He and Lena did not fall back into a whirlwind romance. Trust, once shattered so completely, could not be glued back together into a seamless whole. Instead, they built something new. It was a partnership, founded on shared love for their daughters and a hard-won mutual respect. There were days of quiet understanding and days of tense negotiation over parenting styles. It was real, messy, and more profound than the fairy tale love he had once thought he wanted. He didn't live with them, but his small apartment was only a few blocks away, and most evenings he was there for dinner and bedtime stories. The day the twins started kindergarten was a crisp autumn morning. Lena stood on one side of them, Michael on the other. They were a portrait of a modern family, forged in fire and rebuilt from the ashes. Sophia, bubbling with excitement, ran ahead to join the other kids. Luna hesitated, her small hand clutching Michael's. He knelt down, his eyes level with hers. "It's okay, sweetie," he whispered. "It's a new place. Lots of new colors to draw." She looked from the school doors to her mother, then back to him. Her brow was furrowed with an emotion he couldn't quite decipher. Lena knelt beside him, taking Luna's other hand. "We'll be right here when you get out," she said softly. Luna looked at them both, her two anchors in a swirling sea of newness. Then she let go of their hands and took a tentative step towards the school. The healing culminated not in a grand gesture, but in a small, quiet moment. A few weeks later, the new Hands of Hope Center was hosting its first community event, a small exhibit showcasing the children's artwork. Michael's family was there, his parents having flown in, their faces etched with a mixture of confusion and pride at their son's new life. Lena's family was there, a boisterous, loving crowd that had slowly, cautiously, begun to accept him back into the fold. The gallery was filled with the vibrant, chaotic beauty of children's art. In a place of honor was a joint exhibit by Sophia and Luna. Sophia's side was a riot of color, depicting princesses and dragons and a smiling family under a rainbow. Luna's side was a series of panels, all in her signature shades of blue. They were intricate, beautiful, and deeply personal. Michael was standing in front of Luna's panels, trying to decipher the story they told, when he felt the familiar, small tug on his pants. He looked down. Luna was standing beside him, looking up not at the art, but at his face. Her own crystalline blue eyes were searching his. She pointed a small finger at the central panel, a drawing of a man, a woman, and two small girls under a sprawling, protective tree, a clear echo of the one Lena had painted in their nursery all those years ago. He smiled at her. "It's beautiful, Lunabug. It's my favorite one." She looked at him, her expression serious, her lips slightly parted, as if gathering the courage to do something monumental. The world seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, standing in a sea of color. Then, for the first time in her 5 years of life, Luna spoke. Her voice was a small, hesitant whisper, a sound as miraculous as the first sunrise. "Daddy." The single word struck him with the force of a thunderbolt. It was a key turning in a lock he didn't even know existed. It wasn't just a name, it was an anointing. It was acceptance. It was forgiveness. It was everything he had thrown away and had somehow, impossibly, been given back. Tears streamed down Michael's face as he knelt and pulled his silent daughter into a hug. Lena watched from across the room, her own tears falling freely, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy on her face. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something far more precious. It was a beginning. In a world obsessed with ambition, Michael Cavendish learned the hard way that success means nothing without someone to share it with. Lena, bruised but never broken, showed us that true strength lies in choosing love without losing yourself. Their journey, marked by betrayal, loss, and redemption, reminds us that it's never too late to rewrite your story. Every heartbreak holds a lesson. Every goodbye can become a new beginning. If this story moved you, touched you, or made you believe in second chances again, please like, comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe. There are more powerful, real-life inspired stories coming your way. Until then, choose authenticity, fight for what matters, and never underestimate the power of a quiet voice saying, "I forgive you."